In this lecture, you will learn about the Adams presidency, the Jefferson presidency, Native Americans' resistance, the Madison presidency, the War of 1812, and James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine. Washington was the first U.S. president who had to deal with party divisions and conflicts going on in Europe, but he will not be the last. John Adams will become president after Washington, and under his presidency, party divisions will intensify, and the U.S. will enter a short-lived undeclared war with France. Jefferson will also enter the White House during divisive times and will have to deal with foreign threats. In domestic matters, Jefferson initially turned his attention to establishing a mode of governing that was a clear contrast to that of the Federalist. Jefferson's paramount goal was to scale back the exercise of federal power. Events of the 1790s had caused Jefferson to worry about the stretching of powers in the executive branch, and he had watched his distrust as Hamiltonian policies refinanced the public debt, established a national bank, and secured commercial ties with Britain. In Jefferson's vision, the source of true liberty in America was the independent farmer, someone who owned and worked his land, both for himself and for the market. Jefferson set out to dismantle the Federalist innovations, reducing the sizes of the Army and Navy, abolishing all federal taxes based on population or whiskey, and reducing the national debt through custom duties and the sale of Western lands. A properly limited federal government, according to Jefferson, was responsible merely for running a postal system, maintaining federal courts, staffing lighthouses, collecting custom duties, and conducting a census once every 10 years. At the end of the 7 Years' War, a large area west of the United States shifted from France to Spain, but Spain never effectively controlled it. Spanish officials in New Orleans and St. Louis worried that their sparse population could not withstand an anticipated westward movement of Americans. So in 1800, Spain returned this trans-Mississippi territory to France, hoping a French Louisiana would provide a buffer between northern Mexico and the land-hungry Americans. Jefferson, who did not want to see France grow as a colonial power in North America, sent Robert R. Livingston, America's minister in France, to try to buy New Orleans from the French. Instead, he bought the entire Louisiana territory for the bargain price of $15 million. Initially, there wasn't a consensus about the western border of this land transfer. In Spain's version, the border was about 100 miles west of the Mississippi River, while in Jefferson's eyes, it was some 800 miles further west, defined by the crest of the Rocky Mountains. In late 1803, the American Army took formal control of the Louisiana Territory. Shortly after, Jefferson launched 4 government-financed expeditions up the river valleys of the new territory to establish relationships with Indian tribes and to determine Spanish influence and presence. The first mission was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to investigate Indian cultures, collect plant and animal specimens, and chart the geography of the West. Congress directed the expedition to scout locations for military posts, open commercial agreements for the fur trade, and identify river routes to the west. The expedition was aided by a 16-year-old Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, as well as her husband, a French trapper, and their new baby. Sacagawea acted as a translator, and she and her new baby allowed the American expedition to appear peaceful to suspicious tribes. The expedition reached the Pacific Ocean at the mouth of the Columbia River in November 1805. Three additional U.S. expeditions set forth between 1804 and 1806 from the Mississippi River to probe the contested southwestern border of the Louisiana Purchase. The first exploring party headed into what is now Arkansas, the second traveled into eastern Texas, and the third traveled west from St. Louis over to the Rockies. What is often unspoken when discussing the Louisiana Purchase is that the new American territory was inhabited by Native Americans. One Native American group living in this new territory were the Osage. The Osage ruled the land between the Missouri and the lower Arkansas rivers. The Comanche also ruled the territory, called Comancheria, that stretched from the upper Arkansas River to the Rockies and south into Texas. When it pertains to the Osage and the Comanche, Jefferson's goal was not only to make these groups strong trading partners, but also to transform them into an agricultural civilization. According to Jefferson, if they diminish reliance on the hunt, they will reduce the amount of land that tribes needed to sustain their communities and open that land for settlement. With that in mind, he offered hoes and plows for the men and spinning wheels and looms for the women. The Osage will initially enter an alliance with the U.S. The U.S. will provide farming equipment, and the Osage will get a promise from Jefferson that they will be protected against Indian refugees displaced by American settlers east of the Mississippi. The alliance proved costly for the United States, and peace initiatives were short-lived. The Comanche, on the other hand, proved resistant to attempts to dominate them and will not change their Comancheria practices. However, they did welcome the Americans as new trading partners and invited American traders to travel into Comancheria to their market fairs. Initially, trade flourished between the Americans and the Comanche, with the Americans selling weapons, cloth, and household metal goods in exchange for horses, mules, bison, and furs. Despite what maps showed, the land of Comancheria remained under Indian control and was thus off limits to settlement by white Americans until the late 19th century. Jefferson easily won a second term in office, but governing after 1804 was not easy. France and England then embroiled in a war, and each side warned America not to cheap arms to the other. Britain acted on those threats in 1806, stopping American ships, inspecting cargoes for military aid to France, and seizing suspected deserters from the British Navy, along with many Americans. Ultimately, 2,500 American sailors were impressed into the British Navy. In June of 1807, a British brigade attacked an American ship at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, prompting Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, prohibiting U.S. ships from traveling to all foreign ports and bringing all overseas trade carried in American vessels to a halt. The embargo of 1807 was meant to make Britain suffer and to stall war, but it was a total disaster, bringing the American economy to a standstill. In New England, the heart of the shipping industry, unemployment rose. In the South, grain plummeted in value, river traffic halted, tobacco rotted, and cotton went unpicked. Moreover, in the Northwest, the Shawnee, led by Tenskwatawa, the prophet, and his brother Tecumseh, helped envision an alliance of North America's indigenous populations to halt the encroachment of the United States. Together, they created pan-Indian towns in present-day Indiana, first at Greenville, then at Provincetown, in defiance of the Treaty of Greenville. Tecumseh traveled to many diverse Indian nations, from Canada to Georgia, calling for unification, resistance, and the restoration of sacred power. So when James Madison became president in 1809, he will inherit all these problems that the Jefferson administration faced before. Difficulties with England and France overseas and with Indians in the Old Northwest continued to mount under the Madison administration. By the time Madison took office, Tecumseh actively solidified his Confederacy, while far northern tribes renewed ties with supportive British agents in Canada. If the United States embarked on a war with England, there will clearly be serious repercussions on the frontier. The main issue, of course, was the increasing numbers of white Americans living in Ohio and the territories of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Up to 1805, Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, had negotiated a series of treaties in a divide and conquer strategy, extracting Indian lands for paltry payments. However, with the rise of power of Tecumseh and his brother, Harrison's strategy faltered. One day while Tecumseh was outside on a recruiting trip, Harrison assembled leaders of the Powhatan, Miami, and Delaware tribes to negotiate the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809. Upon his return, Tecumseh was furious with both Harrison and the tribal leaders, and soon left again to seek alliances with tribes further south. Then in November 1811, Harrison attacked Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River. The 2-hour battle resulted in the deaths of 62 Americans and 40 Indians before the Prophet forces fled. The Americans won the battle at Tippecanoe, but Tecumseh was now readier than ever to make war on the United States. The Indian conflicts in the Northwest Territory soon merged into the wider conflict with England, known as the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the result of the continued attacks by England and France on American ships that began during the Jefferson administration. As you learned earlier, Jefferson's embargo had done nothing but hurt the U.S. economically, so in 1809, Congress replaced Jefferson's embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which prohibited trade with France, England, and their respective colonies, but opened up trade elsewhere to diminish the anguish of American shippers, farmers, and planters. However, the English and the French continued impressing Americans, and some in Congress began to talk about the need for war. Although there was some widespread disagreement about the necessity of war with either Britain or France, several dozen of the new and younger members of Congress who became known as the War Hawks, including Henry Clay from Kentucky and John Calhoun from South Carolina, were eager to bring impressment to an end. In June of 1812, Congress declared war on Britain in a vote that was divided along sectional lines. New England and some Middle Atlantic states opposed the war, while the South and the West were strongly for it. Ironically, Britain had just announced that it would stop searching and seizing American ships, but the momentum of the war was unstoppable. The War Hawks initially proposed an invasion of Canada, confidently predicting victory in 4 weeks. Instead, the war lasted 2.5 years, and Canada never fell. At the beginning of the war, the British were quite occupied with Napoleon, so the Americans will initially be able to hold on the mighty British by winning a couple of battles here and there. However, when discussing the War of 1812, we are not going to go over every battle of the war in this course, but some notable mentions include an interesting battle in Lake Erie. Yes, you heard right, Lake Erie. In the Battle of Lake Erie, the American forces successfully fended off the British after a year of back and forth between British-controlled Canada and the U.S. The British will also have the support of Tecumseh and his Confederacy that also plunged into an all-out war. However, with the United States distracted, fighting in the Canadian border, Tecumseh and his Confederate army seized several American forts on their own initiative. If Even then, the Indian Confederacy faced an uphill battle, particularly after American naval forces secured control of the Great Lakes in September 1813, forcing British ships and reinforcements to retreat. Yet Tecumseh and his native allies fought on despite being surrounded by American forces. At one point, Tecumseh told the British commander Henry Proctor the following: "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." Not soon thereafter, Tecumseh fell on the battlefields of Ontario in October 1831. His death had a severe blow to pan-Indian resistance against the United States. Men like Tecumseh, however, left behind a legacy of pan-Indian unity that was not soon forgotten. Another notable mention is the battle at Fort McHenry on the Chesapeake Bay in Baltimore in 1814. In Fort McHenry, the Americans repelled a 19-ship British fleet, enduring 27 hours of bombardment. Watching from aboard a British ship, American poet Francis Scott Key penned the verses of what will become the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Despite these early victories, after Napoleon's defeat in early 1814, the British then began to focus on North America. The British were successful at creating a blockade at the coast. Thanks to the blockade, the British were able to burn Washington, D.C. Yes, burn it to the ground. In August 1814, British ships sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, landing 5,000 troops and throwing the capital into a panic. Then the British will burn most of it to the ground, including the White House. And on August 24, 1814, the British will open a new theater of operations in the South. A large British army landed in Lower Louisiana and encountered General Andrew Jackson and his militia just outside of New Orleans. Jackson secured a decisive victory, becoming an instant hero at the Battle of New Orleans. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans was pretty much useless, since negotiators in Europe had signed a peace agreement 2 weeks earlier titled the Treaty of When, signed in December of 1814. However, the Treaty of When settled few of the surface issues that had led to the war. No one really won the War of 1812. The British nor the Americans got any new territory after the war. But politically speaking, the war hogs did have a major victory by taking up the banner of the Republican Party. The war hogs favored trade, western expansion, internal improvements, and the energetic development of a new economic market. The biggest losers of the war, of course, were the Indians, who lost leaders, land, and the British protectors. Even after winning the War of 1812, President James Monroe will have to deal with Europeans once more. Although Monroe was a Jeffersonian, some of his principles echoed Federalist policies. Whereas Jefferson cut the size of the military and ended all internal taxes in his first term, Monroe advocated the need for a strong military and an aggressive foreign policy. Since Americans were spreading out over the continent, Monroe authorized the federal government to invest in canals and roads. As Federalists had attempted 2 decades earlier, Republican leaders after the War of 1812 advocated strengthening the government to strengthening the nation. In 1816, American troops led by General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida in search of Seminole Indians harboring escaped slaves. Once there, Jackson declared himself the commander of northern Florida and executed 2 British men who he claimed were dangerous enemies. Jackson's move troubled the Monroe administration, but John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain, which delivered Florida to the United States in 1819. In exchange, the United States agreed to abandon any claim to Texas or Cuba. Moreover, Monroe used this as an opportunity to discourage Spain or other Europeans from reconquering Chile, Colombia, Peru, or Mexico. Monroe formulated a Declaration of Principles on South America. Since the beginning of the Latin American independence movements, the United States had been supportive of a hemisphere free of European influence. Now that the independence movements were coming to a close, the Monroe Doctrine warned Europe that any attempt to interfere in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an unfriendly act toward the United States. In exchange for non-interference by Europeans, Monroe pledged that the United States will stay out of European struggles. Although the Monroe Doctrine was to some extent a grasp for regional power, it had early limitations. It dealt with European power in the hemisphere and was not a statement of intent of the United States to dominate the region. Moreover, the idea for a grand declaration about the finality of Latin American independence was not Monroe's nor even Adams' idea. It initially came from British Foreign Secretary George Canning, who had proposed a joint U.S.-British proclamation that would say both governments will oppose French and Spanish efforts to reconquer parts of the Americas. Canning, like the U.S., wanted independent republics so the British could openly trade with Latin American ports. Initially, the United States had little ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine because it lacked military power, but it would set a precedent in which the United States will eventually become a dominant power in the hemisphere. That is all for now, but stay tuned for the next lecture to see what happens next.